You've probably heard the phrase survival of the fittest so many times it feels like a law of nature. Get hurt in the ancient world, and you were left behind. Get sick, and the group moved on without you. Weakness meant death. Simple as that. But the actual evidence buried in the ground tells a very different story. Some of the most disabled human beings who ever lived weren't abandoned. They were carried, fed, and kept alive for years, sometimes decades, by people who had every biological incentive to walk away and didn't. Let's start in northern Iraq, in a cave called Shanidar. In the late 1950s, archaeologist Ralph Selecki uncovered the skeleton of a Neanderthal man who lived roughly 45,000 years ago. Researchers nicknamed him Shanidar 1. When physical anthropologist Eric Trinkhaus examined the bones decades later, what he found was staggering. This man was blind in one eye. His right arm had been fractured so severely in early life that it was withered and useless, likely amputated at the elbow. He had crushing damage to one leg that would have left him with a pronounced limp. And he was almost certainly deaf. By any modern definition, he could not hunt, could not defend himself, and could not survive alone in an Ice Age landscape full of predators. And yet, the bones show he lived for years, maybe decades after these injuries. Someone was feeding him. Someone was protecting him. Someone had decided he was worth keeping alive. Shanidar 1 wasn't even the first case like this to be found, just the most dramatic. Back in 1908, French archaeologists uncovered the skeleton of an elderly Neanderthal man near La Chapelle-aux-Saints in France. He'd lost nearly every tooth years before he died. His jawbone had reabsorbed around the empty sockets, and his spine and hips were riddled with severe arthritis. The scientist who first studied him, Pierre-Marcellin Boule, used the skeleton to paint Neanderthals as hunched, brutish animals, an image that stuck in the public imagination for decades. But later researchers, working with better anatomical methods, realized Boule had misread the evidence entirely. This wasn't a species built to shuffle and grunt. This was one specific old man, arthritic and nearly toothless, who could not have chewed raw meat or tough plant fiber to survive on his own. Somebody was softening his food, maybe even pre-chewing it for him, for years. The posture Boule mistook for a permanent species trait was really just the body of a very old, very cared-for individual. That wasn't an isolated case either. In the 1990s, archaeologists excavating a site called Man Bac in northern Vietnam uncovered the skeleton of a young man who lived around 4,000 years ago, and what they found was even more extreme. Analysis led by archaeologist Lorna Tilley and biological anthropologist Mark Oxenham showed this man had a congenital condition, likely Klippel-Feil syndrome, that left him paralyzed from the neck down before he even reached puberty. He could not walk. He could not feed himself. He could not turn his own body in bed to prevent sores. And he lived like this for roughly 10 more years. Someone repositioned him daily. Someone hand-fed him, cleaned him, kept him alive through a decade of complete physical dependence in a small farming community with no surplus to spare. Tilley didn't just document this case. She built an entire scientific framework around it. In 2012, she and Oxenham formalized what's now called the bioarchaeology of care, a method for reading skeletal remains to reconstruct exactly what kind of caregiving a disabled individual must have received to survive as long as they did. It works backward from injury to effort. A withered limb tells you someone carried a bigger share of the physical work. A toothless elder tells you someone was chewing or mashing food for them. Missing decades of expected decline tell you someone was preventing infection, treating wounds, managing a body that should have failed far sooner than it did. Since then, researchers using Tilley's framework have identified dozens of similar cases across the archaeological record on nearly every continent, spanning tens of thousands of years. But feeding and carrying someone is one thing. Did ancient humans actually try to treat illness the way we'd recognize as medicine? In 2012, a team led by archaeologist Karen Hardy analyzed dental plaque from Neanderthal remains at a cave called El Sidrón in Spain. Trapped in the calcified plaque on one individual's teeth, they found something nobody expected. This particular Neanderthal had a dental abscess and a gastrointestinal parasite that would have caused chronic pain and diarrhea. And embedded in his teeth were traces of poplar bark, a plant that contains salicylic acid, the same active compound found in aspirin. Alongside it, Hardy's team found traces of penicillium mold, the natural source of penicillium-based antibiotics. This wasn't food. Poplar bark has no nutritional value and tastes bitter enough that eating it by accident is almost impossible. Someone, or this man himself, understood that this specific plant did something for pain and used it anyway. And this instinct to self-medicate turns out to be older than our species entirely. In 1987, primatologist Michael Hoffman was observing chimpanzees in Mahale, Tanzania, when he watched a visibly sick female chimp walk past abundant food to seek out one specific plant, Vernonia amygdalina, a shrub so bitter local people call it bitter leaf and use it only medicinally, never as food. She chewed the pith, swallowed the juice, and within a day, her symptoms, later linked to parasitic infection, had cleared. Hoffman documented dozens of similar cases across years of fieldwork, chimps deliberately seeking out specific plants only when sick, plants with measurable antiparasitic and antibacterial compounds. If chimpanzees, without language, without culture in the way we mean it, can identify and use medicine, then the instinct didn't start with us. It's something we inherited, not something we invented. Here's what makes all of this so strange when you actually sit with it. None of this behavior makes sense under a simple survival of the fittest model. A blind, one-armed Neanderthal contributes nothing to the hunt. A paralyzed teenager in Vietnam can't gather food, build shelter, or reproduce. Every single calorie spent feeding them was a calorie not spent on someone who could still contribute. Every hour spent repositioning a body to prevent bed sores was an hour not spent hunting, foraging, or resting. By the cold math of pure resource competition, these people should have been left behind. And yet, across tens of thousands of years and completely unrelated cultures on different continents, the pattern repeats. Someone kept paying that cost anyway. Anthropologist Penny Spikins at the University of York has spent years studying exactly this pattern, and her conclusion reframes the entire question. Compassion, she argues, isn't a late invention of civilization, something that showed up once humans had surplus food and spare time to be kind. It's an ancient survival strategy in its own right, every bit as old as tool use or fire. A group that cared for its injured and its sick wasn't acting against its own interests. It was building something a purely selfish group never could: deep trust. If you know your tribe will carry you when your leg shatters, you take risks a lone competitor wouldn't dare take. You hunt the larger animal. You cross the more dangerous river. Caregiving wasn't the soft, sentimental exception to survival. It was quietly part of the machinery of survival itself. So the next time you picture the ancient world as some brutal filter where only the strongest made it through, remember Shanidar 1, blind and one-armed, fed by hands that had no obligation to feed him. Remember the old man at Chapelle-aux-Saints, toothless and arthritic, his food softened for him year after year, long after he stopped being useful to anyone. Remember the young man at Manbach, paralyzed for a decade, kept clean and turned and alive by people who could have simply let him go. Remember the Neanderthal at El Sidrón, chewing bitter bark because somewhere someone had already learned it eased the pain. None of them survived because they were the fittest. They survived because someone else decided they were worth the cost. That instinct, the one that makes you check on a sick friend, that makes you slow down for someone who's struggling, that makes you show up when there's nothing in it for you, It isn't a modern virtue layered on top of an ancient animal. It's the animal. It's older than agriculture, older than language, maybe older than our own species. Long before anyone wrote down the word compassion, your ancestors were already living it, one difficult, costly act of care at a time.